with the Trump administration right now being formed and just picking new people for his administration, do you think that the Middle Eastern countries, the West Asia countries, are getting to the point that the solution for the conflict in Gaza and in Lebanon, as you mentioned, MBS was talking about it, and all of the leaders are talking about it, and do you think that they're getting to the point that they would consider the solution is in the Middle East, is not in the United States, and the role that the United States can play in the Middle East? Because at the end of the day, we know how much of leverage the Netanyahu and Israelis have on on Washington.
I think people already recognize that to a large degree, but many of these regimes are bound to the United States. Their elites, their leaders were trained in the West. They have palaces in the West. They have assets in the West. They spend their vacations there. They send their families there. They send their children there to study. And probably, if they feel they're about to be overthrown, they have plans to live in the West. So many of these countries or these regimes in the Persian Gulf region or in West Asia, they are, they're stuck with the United States. But at the same time, they also, the elites recognize that the United States is not the power that they thought it to be. For example, when Aramco was struck, the United States wasn't able to do anything about it. In fact, the reason why the war between Yemen and Saudi Arabia came to an end, the genocidal war, which Trump supported, but of course Obama did too. This genocidal war, the reason why it failed ultimately, and the Saudis had to accept a ceasefire, was because Yemen was increasingly striking Saudi oil assets, and the Americans couldn't do anything about it. So gradually, as we move forward, elites in the Persian Gulf region in West Asia increasingly understood the limits of U.S. power. And as we've been moving forward, especially in the last 3 years, especially after Ukraine, and then, of course, the events in Palestine, I think not only did they see U.S. power diminish, but in general, Western soft power was destroyed. The populations across the region are extremely hostile towards Western governments, European governments, North American governments, because they're behind the Holocaust. So it's very difficult for these leaders that are bound to the West to ignore these. And they know that in order to stay in power, they have to be very careful about their population. They also recognize that the power of the United States is sort of like melting ice. So they are seeking to change the nature of their relationship with countries like Iran, Russia, China, among others. But you do see, for example, in the fact that Saudi Arabia, on the one hand, it wants to carry out naval maneuvers with Iran, which is an interesting step. But on the other hand, Saudi Arabia has still refrained from actually joining BRICS, even though it's been invited. So I think that's sort of reflective of where Saudi Arabia stands, and so do other countries in the region. I think that's like an interesting example of how it is. But the difference is that a decade ago, these countries would have been literally on their knees for the Americans. When Trump came in, people across the region were ridiculing the Persian Gulf regimes because they were seen as being milked by Trump, and that's something that he was bragging about. But I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for him to do what he did in the past, because so many things have changed since he left office.
We had a new video message from Netanyahu again to Iranian people. He's trying to convince people to rise up against the government in Iran. do you think recently the new Minister of Defense of Israel, he's called Israel Katz, if I'm not mistaken, he said that they're going to attack nuclear facilities in Iran. And how do you find the rhetoric on their part right now and the way they're talking? If you remember, whenever they wanted to talk Gaza, Lebanon, they send a video message, then they start attacking Lebanon or Gaza. And right now they're doing the same with Iran. How did you find it?
In the West, they have, for decades, they've been saying that the Israelis know this region very well. And the Israelis have always been famous for understanding the so-called Arab mind. Very racist term, but anyway. But I think it just shows that the Israelis actually don't understand the region. And probably they understand it even less than Western elites, which is saying a lot. The West is really clueless about our region. Just watching their elites in think tanks speak, or reading their articles, or watching some of them online or on television, I think shows how uh, their analysis is based on um, wishful thinking and what they want to believe, or what their funders want them to say or want to believe. And the Israelis, I think, are worse than most, if not all, of those in the West. One for example, in the West, they say the Arabs, and we always hear how the Arabs and the Israelis want peace, and they want to cooperate, and they want to be allies. But they're talking about a few Arab dictatorships. The population in the United Arab Emirates is hostile towards the Israeli regime. In Bahrain, it's hostile towards the Israeli regime. In Qatar and Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia and Jordan, they're all very hostile, or in Egypt. But Western elites somehow equate the ruling families with the entire population of the country, which I think is a very dangerous way to look at things. The Israeli regime has not only, in my opinion, not miscalculated when it struck Gaza, because initially they said we're going to starve them. And they were very open about their genocidal intent, as we all know. They said very openly that they're Amalek, and looking to the biblical, the Old Testaments, we see that the Amalek were completely wiped out: women, children, animals, everything. So they're subhuman to the Israelis. They said we're going to cut off water, we're going to cut off food, medicine, electricity, fuel, everything. And that there are no innocents, as the Israeli president said, in Gaza. But they miscalculated. It's well over a year and they've still failed to take Gaza. In fact, they've had significant casualties over the last 72 hours. This is the regime that was able to go all the way to the Suez very swiftly once upon a time, or in Lebanon too. They failed. They failed to take anything in Lebanon. They slaughter people, which is a miscalculation, because every airstrike further angers people across the region, and fingers are pointed not just towards Israel, but towards London, towards Paris, towards Associated Press, towards Reuters, towards CNN, because people see all of these as a part of this effort to destroy the region, to justify the destruction of the region, to protect ethno-supremacism. An ethno-supremacism which really it's a mythological ethnicity, because Jews from Europe are not Semites. Even Jews from Morocco and other parts of the Arabic world are not Semites. The Semites are the Palestinians, who are overwhelmingly non-Jewish. But in any case, the world, the region sees the West as being behind this. So all of these actions by the Israeli regime are miscalculations. And what they did is the exact opposite. They have united the region in a way in which we have never seen before. This is very important, Nima. The meeting of leaders that you alluded to at the very beginning of our discussion is important. The fact that the statements are becoming more harsh. Before the president of Syria and the president of Algeria and the Iranians and a few others were making tough statements. Now it's almost becoming universal. And this is, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you see populations converging. For decades now, the Israeli regime has been trying to divide the region, the Israelis and the Americans and the Europeans, through their embassies, through their governments, through official policy, through NGOs. They've been trying to, through their proxies, local governments, despots, through racism, Arab, Persian, Turk, Kurd, through sectarianism, Shia, Sunni, through religion, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, always trying to create divisions so that they could impose their hegemony more easily. And now we see that there is total unity among many populations in the region. And when I say total unity, I'm looking at the resistance in the surrounding areas around Palestine, and I find that to be amazing, absolutely stunning, and how popular the resistance has become, how views towards Iran has changed, especially when Ayatollah Khamenei gave his famous Friday prayer speech, and he gave the second sermon in Arabic, which was broadcast across the Arabic world live. It had a huge impact. And this is largely due to the policies of the Israeli regime. Its own stupidity has created this awakening and brought these people together. And the same is true inside Iran. The United States and the Europeans have done a lot of work over the years to create division in Iran. Through terrorism, through funding different groups, through the sanctions. The sanctions have been brought about to crush Iranian civil society, just like in Venezuela, just like in Cuba, and to create anger and despair so that people would rise up against the government, and so that the Americans in the West could install a regime that's to their liking. That's basically what the policy has always been with sanctions. That's what they tried with Russia as well. They tried to turn the ruble into rubble and basically undermine the state and undermine Russia. It failed, but they do cause discontent and violence in countries, and that includes Iran. But what has happened over the last year, because of the genocide in Gaza, is that people in Iran, especially young people, who I once mentioned, a lot of young people who do not have a strong sense of history, especially after Corona, a lot of these young people felt that Iran was the problem, and that the West wants peace and stability, and they support human rights and human values, and that Iran has a grudge, and that it's the so-called regime in Iran that is the troublemaker, and if it wasn't for this regime in Tehran, we would have peace and stability and friendship with Europe. Some of these people were among my own undergraduate students, mostly undergraduate students, like between 17, 16 to 22, 21, that age. There were lots of young people in that age group. The last year has destroyed the image of the West. It has destroyed the image of the Israeli regime. People don't consider the West to be have anything to do with human rights. They see them as the greatest enemy of human rights and human dignity and women's rights and children's rights. And so I think that Netanyahu really doesn't understand where things stand in the region today. He has been able to slaughter many people. He has been able to ruin the lives of families. You wake up in the morning and you see images of a woman who's lost her husband and all her children. Or you hear of a man who went out to buy bread and he comes back and everyone has been killed. You hear these, or you see the images of dead people lying around every day. This pleases the Israelis from what we see and hear from their Telegram channels and how they enjoy this, but they are destroying themselves and they're uniting the region and they're uniting people within countries in the region against the Israeli regime. So I think that Netanyahu's statement, any statement that he makes, whether it's towards the Lebanese people or the Iranian people or the people of Yemen, it's only going to be ridiculed if it doesn't have the opposite effect. I don't even think people take it serious enough for it to have the opposite effect. But Lebanon is another good example. The West has always tried very hard, as well as their regional proxies, to divide Lebanon. And that is what the dirty war in Syria was about. The West tried to undermine Syria because Syria was the only country in the region, the only government surrounding around the Israeli regime that was resisting Israel. So the West and their regional allies and proxies tried to undermine it. The same policy was always pursued in Lebanon. So you saw divisions that were sectarian based, often racially based, because they tried to depict the resistance as Iranian and not non-Arab, or not. So that has been going on for a very long time. Now the sectarianism has been cast aside. Palestinians support Hezbollah. The Sunni, I mean, you always had people, you had Sunnis who supported Hezbollah, those who were opposed to Hezbollah, those who were influenced by the West and the Saudis and others, and then the Christian community and the Druze community. They're always trying to keep them divided, but now you see everyone has been aligned, and the West is desperately trying to use their ally, people like Samir Jaja and others who were actually implicated, who were involved in the Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982, where 3,500 Palestinians and Shia were slaughtered by these militias supported by the Israeli regime that had occupied Beirut. These are the allies of the United States in Lebanon. The rest of Lebanon, for the most part, is hostile towards the Israeli regime. So what Israel has done, what the United States has done, what the EU has done, what the British and the Canadians have done, is that they brought unity to this region at different levels that was non-existent before. And I think that will have major implications in the weeks and months ahead. And again, another point that we have to remember is that this does not bode well for regimes that are pro-American. Does not bode well for them. They can, what we saw over a decade ago in North Africa, in Tunisia, when a young man burned himself alive, we saw how it shook the whole region. Right now, pro-American regimes should be far more fearful of the streets than they were back then.
Yeah. The finance minister of Israel is talking about the annexation of the West Bank. In his eyes, Donald Trump's presidency would facilitate the process of annexation of Gaza, of the northern part of Gaza, the West Bank. Do you think that with what we've seen so far, we know that the Middle Eastern country or the West Asian countries, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, all these are talking about the problem that they're facing in Gaza and in Lebanon. But the way even with Saudi Arabia in this summit, MBS said that they have to, he was calling that they have to consider, their concern is the problem in Gaza and in Lebanon, both of them. And they're not considering any sort of, even with Saudi Arabia, relationship with the government in Israel. as long as they're having the problem of Gaza and Lebanon, and there is no, as long as that there is no possibility of having a Palestinian state. If they go in that direction, if they go in the policy of annexation, and Donald Trump, we know that Donald Trump, the behavior of Donald Trump would help them, would just support them, whatever they want to do. But what the Islamic countries can do in order to just make some sort of warning for the administration in Washington?
I agree. I think that Trump would most probably view any such annexation favorably, even though he may have reservations deep down, because any sane person would. But I think that would make things even worse for the United States and for the Israeli regime, because the outrage is building up. And the excuse of October the 7th for carrying out this daily genocide in Gaza is no longer accepted even by the most faithful supporters of the West in this region. No one believes that that what's going on has anything to do with October the 7th. And so when they expanded the genocide or the genocidal strikes to Lebanon, it only made things, I think, worse for the Israeli regime. And if they extend this policy towards the West Bank, even though there are daily killings in the West Bank, which are not reported in the Western media because it doesn't serve their purpose, it is only going to create further outrage. And again, as I said, at some point, the dam could burst. And if it does, I think the US presence in this region will come to an end. The Americans are in a very, very dangerous situation, because the only thing that is that's preserving their presence in the region are few very corrupt families in the Persian Gulf. That's it. That's the only thing that preserves US presence in this region. And those families are desperate on the one hand because they feel that they need the United States. They feel they need they feel the need for the United States because they're so, as I said before, bound to the West, and because they have no popular legitimacy, regardless of the issue of elections. But people want one thing: they want to support Palestine. They don't want to support Palestine. So they don't have popular legitimacy. But they also recognize that the West the empire is collapsing. So you can imagine how uncomfortable they feel right now. And that could lead to many things. Some spark could lead to a major, forest fire. Who knows what lies ahead? So the Israeli regime is playing a very, very dangerous game, and the United States, by supporting it, is playing with its own its own fate in our region. And many would like to see that, by the way. Many in the United States would like to see that. Why do you think that right after Trump was elected, we heard the news that Iran wanted to assassinate Trump, coming from the FBI? My belief is that the very same people who tried to kill Trump are trying to raise tensions between Trump and Iran. Otherwise, the accusations are ridiculous. No one has, the person behind it is not in the United States. It's ridiculous. But they want to increase. Why do you think the Americans, the current administration, is so keen on swiftly sending all of the committed aid to Ukraine before the change in government? Right now, the Biden regime, the National Security Advisor, Sullivan, all of them are stating that, yes, we're going to send all the aid that Congress has allowed us to send to Ukraine before the government comes to an end, before Trump comes to power. Why? Because they want to raise tensions between Russia and the United States as much as possible to prevent de-escalation. The same is true with our region. They want to prevent de-escalation. So there are people who would want to see an escalation in our region, who would want to see an escalation in Ukraine because of their hatred for Trump in the people in the United States. So that there's that added uh, element there already. But U.S. allies in this region are very fragile, and they are not popular. And so, if the Israelis, it's sort of like the camel that broke the straw that broke the camel's back. At some point, you're going to see a major collapse. And when Iran strikes the Israeli regime, I think that will be another uh, uh, straw on the back of the overburdened camel, because people are seeing the vulnerability of the Israeli regime for the first time. They've seen it in Gaza, they've seen it in Lebanon. Hezbollah has been they're extraordinary. They've kept the regime at bay. The regime, after we're approaching 2 months now, the regime has been unable to enter Lebanon. It's amazing. This has never happened before. Hezbollah is holding their ground. All they do is they come into a village, they blow up people's homes, and then they go back. Or they bomb Beirut and slaughter people, or they bomb refugees across it. That's their only success, and that only creates further hate for the regime. So I think that we are very, if when Iran strikes back, it will again show the weakness of the regime. It will also humiliate those governments that are not taking measures against the regime, such as Erdogan. People in Turkey are very much opposed to Israel, but they see their government betraying the people of Palestine. It's going to put more pressure on Turkey. It's going to put more pressure on Jordan. It's going to put more pressure on the Emirates and Egypt and everyone else. And that, I think, is something very dangerous for the United States.
Yeah. As you've mentioned, do you think that we had the attack from Hezbollah and Houthis on Israel? In both of these attacks, the air defense system didn't work properly as they expected to work. And we had the new air defense system, THAAD system from the United States, that didn't work. And at the same time, they're talking about attacking Iran, and they know how capable Iran is if they go in that direction. And we know from the latest interviews that Donald Trump may be, we don't know for sure, but his pick for the vice president, or his vice president, J.D. Vance, was talking about that we are not interested in a direct conflict with Iran. Do you think that there is still some sort of hope in Israel that they can bring the United States into the conflict in the Middle East?
Yes, definitely. I personally think that Trump is not the best option for Netanyahu. I actually think that he would have been better off with Harris. Because, first of all, Trump's opponents will use any support for Israel and for the genocide to put pressure on him. They'll use anything they can to put pressure on him. So his opponents are of different sorts. They're ordinary people who many have tried to protest and they've been crushed in the United States. But they're also the Democrats who want to undermine Trump. And while they were quiet and during the Biden presidency, they will probably use any opportunity to attack Trump. So Trump will have internal pressure on him, especially as I think the economic situation in the United States deteriorates. It's going to get worse for him. But also, Trump has a grudge. If we recall, Trump, when he was removed from power and it was declared that Biden won, Netanyahu immediately removed his picture from I think it was his X or his Twitter account, and that angered Trump. Also, Trump said some very negative things about him when they murdered General Soleimani. He said he backed out at the last moment. So Trump is not I doubt he has great love for Netanyahu personally. And I think at some point he would like to undermine him, not to undermine the Israeli regime, but to undermine Netanyahu. So my guess is that it's probably in the long run, he's probably uh, not all that good for Netanyahu. And I personally believe that the biggest enemy that Israel has is Netanyahu. The longer he stays in power, the more rapid is the decline of the Israeli regime. I think he's only serving his own interests. He's not even serving the interests of this racist regime, and that is going to have huge, enormous consequences in the future. But in addition to that, I think Trump is going to have multiple crises at home, and he is not going to be very keen on expanding his presence in the region, especially, and this is just my guess. This is just my guess. I think that the Iranians will strike the Israeli regime very hard well before his presidency. And I think that the Iranians will, and again, this is my personal calculation or my personal analysis. I think the Iranians will be trying to show to Netanyahu and to others that, not to underestimate Iran's capabilities, but also not to underestimate Iran's will. And that if Iran is struck, Iran will strike back very hard. So I said once before, when Iran first retaliated after the Israeli regime struck Iran's embassy in Syria, Iran fired a warning shot. It had there were other things that they did. It was an intelligence gathering operation. The Israelis and the Americans spent billions of dollars trying to shoot down those cheap drones and a handful of missiles, but it was also a warning shot. The second time, it was a slap in the face after the Israelis murdered Ismail Haniyeh, after he was martyred in Tehran. The Iranians decided to slap the Israelis in the face. And then when the Israelis tried to attack Iran, regardless of the fact that it was more or less a failure, they didn't have the impact that they wanted, and it's clear. I mean, they did some damage, but they didn't do anything really important. It's clear that the Iran's power is much greater, but Western media and Western analysts are trying to play up the Israeli capabilities and play down the Iranian capabilities. So I think this time around, the Iranians are going to teach the Israeli regime a lesson. And I think that will be something that Trump will have to keep in mind when he assumes office, because a war with Iran is not something that he will win, and Iran will not back down. And one thing that I forgot to mention earlier, and that is when the Israeli, I think, defense minister, as you pointed out, said that, maybe you didn't say it, but he said that now we have an opportunity to destroy Iran's nuclear program. He can't. The nuclear program, regardless of Iran's air defenses, which are quite formidable, but they are deep underground. For example, they were saying that they destroyed the mixers. I mean, first of all, if we discussed this before, if they hit these installations, there would be huge secondary explosions, and there were none. And there were no real there were no explosions in the first place. But the mixers are all underground. They've been moved underground many years ago, not because of Israel, because of the United States. The Iranians have been planning for a potential U.S. attack on the country for decades now. So the nuclear program, the key elements of the defense program, they're all well protected. They cannot be destroyed through conventional weapons. So the Israelis don't have that power, but Iran does have the power to destroy Israel. Without a doubt, it does. Iran has hundreds of thousands of missiles and drones. and more than enough can be used against Israel. And the missiles that Iran would be using against the United States if they entered the war, they would be short-range missiles that could, strike everything across the Persian Gulf within minutes, and there would be nothing left. So the Iranians have been preparing themselves not for Israel; they've been preparing themselves for the United States. So I think Trump, he will take note of that when he comes to office, and as he has an opposition at home that hates him, and since he has made many promises to make America great again, uh, and since things in the U.S. economy are going to deteriorate quite fast, even according to his own supporters. I think uh, uh, Musk said something like that a week or two ago before the election. He said that there's going to be great difficulty ahead for the U.S. economy. I think when you put all these together, it's going to be very difficult for the United States under Trump or under anyone, but in particular under Trump, to get directly involved in a military conflict.